Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals for updates and for support of the channel. And for those who are already supporting, thank you for your support that helps keep the channel going. So today, Terminal Philosophy and I are referring back to the history of warfare. We're going back to Greece. We've taken a break from Greece since the end of the Diadochi Wars. But now we're back because the Roman subjugation of Greece. Well, while Rome is busy fighting Carthage, there's actually a lot going on in Greece, which a lot of the history books, even military history, tends to gloss over, even though at the time the ancients considered it quite important. Lives of men like Aratus, Cleomenes, and Philopoemen all have biographies in Plutarch, and Plinius writes a lot about them as well. So these are important figures and personages, even at the time. So the two sources we have for the Achaean League and the rise of and the Cleomenean War are Polybius and Plutarch. Now, the first Achaean League, we don't really have a whole lot of written materials. They tended to be more of an informal organization that dealt with they sort of mastered the art of arbitration between other city-states, and they got started arbitrating the strife in the Magna Graecia, which is today southern Italy. And as more of a diplomatic and informal structure, they were not really able to compete with Sparta and Thebes during the great showdown that occurred in the 4th century, and clearly weren't able to negotiate a settlement. And when Philip finally imposed his Corinthian League on Greece and the Peloponnesus, they were effectively a dead letter. It was just, a symbolic structure rather than anything real. And Polybius attributes this to lack of spirited leadership. But the Second Achaean League, which begins in the 124th Olympiad between 284 and 280 BC, beginning with two cities in the Peloponnesus, Patrae and Dyme. With the death of the Diadochi generals, the sort of imposing Macedonian forces fell in amongst themselves to infighting. So no longer did you have the great names like Demetrius the Besieger or Lysander or Seleucus the Great. All of those men were now busy, their successors were busy fighting amongst themselves. And Pyrrhus went to Italy. So we see in the Peloponnesus the rise of the Second League. And what makes this league interesting is that it was based off of a sort of, according to Polybius, a radical democratic tendency, where unlike the leagues of Sparta, the Peloponnesian League and the Peloponnesian War, and Athens' Delian League, were a single city-state, i.e. Sparta, and Athens was the sort of de facto ruler of all the others, there wasn't really a de facto head of the league. The different strategoi were elected from different cities on a more equal footing. And the overall strategic impulse of this was, one, to unite the Peloponnesus, two, was to establish democracies throughout the Peloponnesus, and three, to maintain equality between the members. And as Polybius points out, they had two very spirited and dynamic leaders. There was for the first 25 years, you had Margos, who was a strategoi, and in the 4th year of Margos' strategoiship, Aratus of Sicyon joined the league, and Aratus becomes the leader of the Achaean League during the Cleomenean War. During the strategoiship of Margos, we also see the cities of Pherae, Triteia, Leontium, Aegium, Aegira, Pellene, Bura, and Cyrenia joining the league. And what's interesting is that both Polybius and Plutarch point out that many of these cities that were ruled by tyrants voluntarily submitted to democratic rule, where the tyrants themselves voluntarily gave up power and on the word that they would be allowed to live as free citizens within the league. Some of them even being elected as strategoi, which is quite unusual given that throughout this period in Greek history, very seldom did tyrants behave so reasonably, and very seldom did the democratic elements give them such an easy way out. Going back to Athens and the Delian League, they often acted in a high-handed manner, as we saw with Milos and the Melian dialogues and Thucydides' history. And in part, that hurt their cause. And plus, the fact that Athens exalted itself over the other cities also hurt its cause. So we could see that the Achaean League, in many ways, was a more pure expression of the democratic league that was being projected by Athens 2 centuries earlier. Now, with Aratus, he successfully campaigned against Antigonus Gonatas of Macedonia, kicking him out of Corinth and the Acrocorinthus. And he also convinced Megara to join the League. And so his overall policy prior to the Cleomenean War was to keep Macedon out of the Peloponnesus and maintain Achaean hegemony in the region, as well as to keep the Aetolians out. And so at this point, right on the verge of the Cleomenean War, we have two leaders that really are interested in broader conflicts. Aratus, who wants to bring in more cities to the League, and his attack on Elis is used as a casus belli in 227 by Cleomenes to attack. And Cleomenes, who has recently launched a coup against the Ephors and radically returned Sparta's constitution to its original austerity, also needs an excuse to get people to look away from what he just did. So there's this two leaders that both have interests to deflect to a broader conflict, and which we'll get to shortly. So terminal philosophy, what are your thoughts on the rise of the League?
Right. Well, I think it's important to point out that this was Greece's sort of first attempt at some sort of city-state confederation. The first league, which started in the 5th century BC, not much has been written about that other than what Polybius and Plutarch have told us. It was just sort of an informal confederation with limited cooperation. It was more something out of convenience than it was something that was deeply sort of impulsive on the part of the Greeks. Polybius seems to indicate sort of different tactics and strategy and how the League adapted to a hoplite fighting style. Specifically in 208, the general of the League, who you sort of referenced, Philopoemen, he reformed the League and became, the League at that point became more Macedonian in its fighting style. And according to Plutarch, as a direct quote, Philopoemen persuaded them, the League that is, to adopt long pike and heavy shield instead of spear and buckler, to protect their bodies with helmets and breastplates with greaves, and to practice stationary and steadfast fighting instead of the nimble movements of light armored troops. So, in preparation for this episode, what I did notice is that before the so-called reforms of 208 took place on the part of Philopoemen, it was the fighting styles and sort of the strategy of the League's army was basically a light armored, light infantry tactics and light infantry in its structure. And there was, yes, of course, there were hoplite formations, but the hoplite formation was not being best, I would say, it was not being best exploited because of the light armor element within the hoplite formation itself. And so that's really the first thing that comes to mind. But Aratus and Philopoemen are its most notable leaders and its most notable generals. But other than that, yes, I think that it's just basically, the Second League is what formed in the 3rd century BC, and that was basically, with the exception of Sparta, is basically all of the Peloponnese. So I think, I think that's a decent intro into the Achaean League.
Right. So now, as to the actual origin of the Cleomenean War, so the first thing here is when Aratus is pressuring Sparta, he tries to take the cities of Tegas and Ochomanus and fails to take them. Now, the other thing that he does then is he pivots to the north to try to take Elis, which is sort of allied to Sparta. And what precipitates this is that the Aetolian League has already petitioned Acarnania with the king of Epirus and is now conspiring with Sparta to divide the Achaean League between them, because the Aetolian League is in the central regions of Greece, so south of Epirus, south of Macedon, but sort of north of the Peloponnesus. And they are historic enemies of the Achaean League, and they often are in competition with each other. Now, what ends up happening is, after the death of Antigonus Gonatas, you have Antigonus Docen, his son, who takes over. And this leads to a unique alliance. Aratus says, well, look, I fought your dad back in the day and kicked you out of Corinth. But if Sparta and the Aetolians defeat us and divide us up, don't you think they're going to come after you next? And if they come after you next, at that point, will you be strong enough to even defeat them, say somewhere in the Boeotia? And that leads to a series of negotiations, which we'll get to a little bit later. But the war starts rather poorly for the Achaean League. At the Battle of Lycium in 227 BC, the Achaeans outnumber the Spartans of Cleomenes, but Aristomachus, who was the former tyrant of Argos, who is now a leader in the war, decides to decline battle with Cleomenes. Now, while he has a larger army, as you pointed out already, this army was not organized in the Macedonian fashion, and nor at this point was Cleomenes yet. He makes that reform right before the Battle of Sellasia. But the Spartans are still fighting in the more traditional hoplite formation, which in open battle would have the advantage over light troops. So while politically it looks bad, it seems that Aristomachus made the correct decision to decline a direct confrontation with Sparta. The Achaeans capture Saphe, and then Ptolemy III sees Sparta as a counterbalance to Macedon and decides to subsidize his war effort. And that subsidy will come important later. And so the Spartans then continue to push. They attack Achaean forces again in the area. Sparta was able to declare victory, and at first it was appeared that Aratus killed, but he later was able to secure Mantinea as an ally, which then indicated that he was still alive and able to. And we'll see this a lot. A lot of these cities are flipping rather rapidly between the Achaean League and the Spartan League, and it seems that often what's the case is who has the army there at the moment. As soon as one army leaves and another army shows up, they'll switch. In the same year, at the Battle of Laodicea, Cleomenes bribes the efforts to continue the war with the Achaeans, and he marches to Leuctra to threaten Megalopolis. The Achaean army is sent out to engage him. Aratus sends out his forces up to a ravine outside of the walls of the city and tells them to stop and not attack because his forces have a lot of cavalry in them and they're not suitable for that area. But Laodatius of Megalopolis ignores the order and attacks Cleomenes. And Cleomenes' Cretan archers and Tarentine a light foot defeat them in the ravine and scatter them. Aratus is condemned for the defeat, even though technically it wasn't his fault. Insubordination was the reason why he lost the battle, and no more attacks occur that year. And then Dyme in 226, there's a new strategos, Hyperbatus, who fights Cleomenes, and Plutarch is rather thin on the details, assuming that he's just completely scattered. So presumably he ignored the good strategy of Aristomachus and just fought them head-to-head and was crushed. And so we see at this point, this is the high water mark. Well, we're nearing the high water mark of Sparta. At this point, the Achaeans are in trouble, and they need to call in Macedonian aid. One of the sticking points to this is, of course, Corinth, which had been liberated from the Macedonians. Antigonus Docen says, well, look, unless you give me Corinth back, I'm not going to invade the Peloponnesus. And Aratus is like, well, we can't really do that because I liberated that from your father just a few decades ago. And so that becomes a sticking point until a bit later in the war. And so at this point, Cleomenes is handily winning. He's won 3 battles in a row and completely scattered the forces of the Achaeans. The other thing that we see is that the Achaeans are able to rapidly raise new forces with surprising speed. So it seems like Sparta's caught in this game of, well, if we lose one battle, it's over because they can't seem to recover from a single defeat. And the Achaeans can seem to lose many battles and still call in new troops. That being said, their military prowess was inferior to that of the Spartans. And it was really the Macedonians that were coming in that would bring the decisive factor. So this first phase of the war, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're absolutely right in the sense that Sparta in these first 3 battles and these opening years against the League were really successful. And I think one of the things that helped that along was that Ptolemy III of Egypt, who had initially been an ally of the League with their wars against Macedon, the Ptolemaic Egypt eventually shifted its support away from the League and had shifted over to Sparta because there was basically, the writing was on the wall that the League was struggling to gain any sort of success in the Peloponnese. Places like Elis, and I think it was Mount Lycaeum or Lycaeum, however you want to pronounce that. Um, these places were just a kind of disasters for the league in general, and of course, too, with Corinth not being returned to Antigonus Doson, there, I don't know, there was just a lot of indications that the league was failing to become any sort of regional military power. So I thought that that was interesting. And this is, of course, a bit after this is a while after the Diadochi Wars, and there was many bankrolling of different foreign powers on the part of Ptolemaic Egypt. And one of them, in terms of on the Greek homeland, was, of course, away from the Achaean League and to the Spartans. And what you mentioned earlier, too, is correct, I think, about Sparta in the sense that Sparta was sort of acting, I mean, there was a lot of momentum that was happening in places like Elis and the northern part of the Peloponnese, as well as central Peloponnese and the northern part of Laconia or Laconia, which is by this is northward towards Argos, where of course Pyrrhus was killed. But their campaigning northward was going quite well, and places like Megalopolis as well. So yeah, it's a great start to the war for Sparta, and they also had the financial support of the very wealthy Ptolemaic dynasty from Egypt.
Now, this extended negotiation that takes place, one of the things that Aratus does is the city of Megalopolis is extremely important throughout this war and is the birth city of Philopoemen. Now, what needs to be mentioned is that Megalopolis historically was under the Spartan yoke and regained independence only after the Thebans under Epaminondas marched down into the Peloponnesus to break the Spartan power, where he fortified that city, among others, in order to check Spartan growth. And so we'll see that a lot of the motivations here is that the Megalopolians do not want to be under Spartan rule ever again, especially the leading men. And so what Aratus does is he sends two men from Megalopolis, Nicophanes and Serticus, to Macedon, with the argument that I already made that, if you let the Spartans get too powerful, they'll come for you next. Capitalizing on his victories at Lycium, Laodicea, and Hecatombium, Cleomenes also exerts control over Cyphae, Pelene, Phineus, Argos, Philius, Cleonone, Epidaurus, Hermoine, Troezen, and Corinth. Now, one of the things that he does is he offers to become the new strategoi of the league. And one of the things that he does to get these cities to switch sides is offer to forgive all the debts. And a lot of these city-states think that's a really good idea. And that's in part why he's able to win so many to his cause. But it's something that he's not really able to fulfill, which he'll get into a little bit later. But eventually, once Corinth is lost to Cleomenes, there's no impediment now to Antigonus being offered Corinth again, because now Corinth is seen as an enemy of the league. And with all of that squared away, Antigonus Doson raises an army and marches into the Peloponnesus. Now, because the Aetolian League is guarding the pass at Thermopylae, which is when we covered the rise of Philip, could still be defended against a large force, he decides to, which at this point was guarded by the Aetolians, he decides to circumvent that by going to Eubea and then marching through Attica into the Isthmus of Corinth. Now, Cleomenes decides to hold the pass, the Corinthian Isthmus. Now, what's interesting, and he fortifies the Annonian hills. And so this is important. One of the things we'll read with both Plutarch and Polybius is Cleomenes is a master of entrenchment. He builds fortified camps, he fells trees, he digs ditches, he builds palisades. It seems pretty clear that somebody was taking notes from the Romans, because the Macedonians don't do this, the Greeks generally don't do this, and least of all the Spartans. It was once Sparta's boast that the walls of Sparta were its own men. So clearly a lot has changed since the heyday in the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars. We've already seen the Great Trench during the siege of Sparta in 272 BC, when they're attacked by Pyrrhus. And what's interesting is that position along the isthmus could have been held. At Latium, Antigonus tries to break through, and the Spartans check him decisively. He then tries to cross at Sicyon. But here's what happens, though. Aratus is still around. And the citizens of Argos are upset that their debts were not forgiven, and finding elements inside still loyal to the Achaean League, he then flips the city. Now, this puts Cleomenes in a very precarious situation. His entire lines of communication are threatened back to Laconia, and he's afraid that if he stays to blockade the Isthmus of Corinth, then the Achaeans will directly invade Sparta. And so he withdraws his forces all the way back to Laconia, which then gives the Macedonians free rein to invade Greece. So now this is the second phase of the war. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, the flipping of Argos, as that basically, I mean, as you just said, that really jeopardized the strategic fortification of the isthmus. And this is right along Corinth, Acrocorinth, and Lycaeum, which is just southwest of another city called Megara, and that is towards Athens, and that's just north of the isthmus. And so he basically had the league properly bottlenecked there. Now the isthmus is it's so small that you can send amphibious, assaults and pincer movements on either side of the isthmus, and that's been done in multiple wars, both on the Gulf of Corinth as well as the Saronic Gulf. So the Corinthian Gulf is to the northwest, the Saronic Gulf is to the east. So it's not difficult for the Greeks to go around this. However, with Argos flipping over to the Achaean League, that is basically an in-between. It's like a waypoint between the Isthmus and Laconia. So there was not much that he could do about that, and you basically leave your forces cut off at that point, depending on what the military, I guess you could say, the garrison of Argos would do to threaten his overall position. Now, other than that, this is sort of the turning point for the league, where they are starting to adopt more of the Philopoemen's Macedonian style of fighting as well. And again, these reforms took place in well, actually, no, this is a bit later, so I'm jumping the gun here just a bit. But again, those reforms took place in 208. But this is when you're starting to see the adoption of more of moving away from a light infantry phalanx and adopting more of a heavy infantry style of phalanx. So yeah, but this is basically the Battle of Midway, if you want to call it that, for the Achaean League, in the sense that this is the turning point where more cities are starting to flip, because the bottom line is that most of these Greek city-states didn't want to be under a Spartan hegemony, because people had, I guess you could say, the Greeks of the Peloponnese knew how brutal an occupation by the Spartans might be, whereas someone or being under occupation by a city-state like Athens, for example, would just require payment, and it wouldn't require this complete dominance or sort of cultural dominance on the part of the Spartans. So yeah, I would say that's the main primary reason why many of these cities started flipping towards the Achaean League, away from Sparta.
Yes. Now this highlights the level to which the Macedonians had elevated the art of war. They had continued the legacy of Philip and Alexander and Demetrius and Pyrrhus. So when Argos is threatened, the Macedonians send 1,500 troops by sea to Epidaurus, and they attack in tandem with Timoxenos, the Achaean strategos, who had been leading troops from the Battle of Sicyon. Now, they reduced it down to the citadel, and as Cleomenes is withdrawing through this region, he tries to relieve his own allies. He, in fact, is able to march into the city through an underground tunnel into the citadel. And his light troops, especially his Cretan archers, are able to rain havoc on the troops within the city from the walls that they've now captured. But Cleomenes, who initially sent in 2,000 men with his uncle, were defeated, and his uncle was killed, so he has to send in more troops. But when he realizes that Antigonus is hot on his heels, he continues his flight down to the Peloponnesus. Now, Antigonus, being an heir to the Macedonian siege techniques, takes Tegea or Kamanas, Mantinea, and Herrera and Telphusa. And then he retires to winter quarters, where he then disperses much of his troops back to Macedon, while he himself stays in the Peloponnesus in order to continue to make meeting. Well, he continues at Aegium to attend league meetings with Aratus for planning for future war. Now, during the winter of 223 BC, Cleomenes is not idle. Cleomenes is preparing for a coup de main by taking Megalopolis, which is one of the most loyal cities to the League. Now, at this point, Cleomenes has reformed his hoplites to fight in the Macedonian fashion with the long pikes and close formations. Seeing that Antigonus has sent his force to winter quarters, Cleomenes is trying to do two things. He's trying to take advantage of the dispersal of troops to take Megalopolis, and he's also trying to bait Antigonus to fight him with a much reduced force by demonstrating that the Achaean League and their Macedonian allies, can't stop his forces from marching around. Antigonus is too prudent a general to take the bait, but that comes at a price. It comes at the price of Megalopolis. So Cleomenes, in his attack, basically finds an unguarded part of the wall and sends Pantius to secure and hold it. And then from there, they then break in and take over. Many of the citizens flee to Messene. Now, what's interesting is one of the noblemen in the town, Lysandridatus, convinces Cleomenes to return the city to its freedom on condition they become a Spartan ally. But part of the problem is that many leading men, including Philopoemen, reject the offer. And at this point, Cleomenes is outraged and burns the city to the ground and loots 300 talents. So at this point, we see that Antigonus doesn't take the bait, showing his superior generalship. We see that Cleomenes only makes more enemies by raising Megalopolis, and is in fact has not advanced his position at all, except by gaining more wealth. But the wealth that he gains isn't enough to displace the loss of the subsidies that he's going to get from Ptolemy III of Egypt. In fact, around this time, Ptolemy III is beginning to realize that Sparta is in fact not a check to Macedonian power, having had all of the gains completely reversed within a year by Antigonus, and pulls the plug. And at this point, Sparta's up against a wall. So this is the third phase of the conflict.
Right. Yeah. This after Megalopolis was basically completely destroyed and part of the population was massacred. The main takeaway from that is that Sparta just had created even more enemies, and it was really a PR disaster. And also, Antigonus did not take the bait in terms of being led into sort of this an urban combat with Cleomenes. So that was superior generalship, and really the larger the repercussion there is that Megalopolis, the citizenry didn't want to fall under Spartan control anymore, and so they were willing to basically flee their homes rather than and flee northward towards places like Argos, and as well as not only did Megalopolis exit the Spartan hegemony, but also Epidaurus and I think it's Sicyon or Sicyon, however it's pronounced. You'll have to forgive me on that one, but multiple cities, not just Megalopolis, around the same time were fleeing Spartan influence, and the fact that Megalopolis was basically razed, and the only thing that Cleomenes was able to accumulate from that was around 300 talents of loot and treasure from the city. So that was really his only payoff. But that wasn't going to that was going to spread incredibly thin across Sparta's military hegemony.
Right. So now we get to the crux of the war, the Battle of Larissa. So what we see here is that Cleomenes, at the beginning of the year 222, had taken up a strong defensive position in Laconia, defending the passes into Sparta's heartland with trenches and palisades and felled trees, and taking strong defensive positions, knowing that he was outnumbered by the massive Macedonian army by at least, I think, 10,000 men. And therefore, it would behoove him to take this defensive position. But eventually, he had to risk battle because Macedon had the deeper pockets now that the the Ptolemaic Egyptians had given up support for him. So if we look at the grand army of the Macedonians and Achaeans, Antigonus and the League mustered a huge army. 10,000 Macedonian phalangites, 3,000 peltasts, and 300 horse were the Macedonian contingent. From the League and mercenary allies, you had 1,000 agrari, 1,000 Gallic mercenaries, 300 elite Achaean horse, and 1,000 megalopolitans armed in the Macedonian manner, led by Serticus of Megalopolis. So the 300 Achaean horse, I'm pretty sure, led by Philopoemen, and they'll show up later. Allies included 2,000 infantry and 200 horse from Boeotia, 1,000 foot from Epirus, 1,000 from Acarnania, 1,600 from Illyria, under the command of Demetrios of Pharos. The League Macedonian army was a total of 28,000 foot and 1,200 horse. Cleomenes chose his position well. He chose the pass in through Sellasia. So, sorry, Larissa's another battle earlier. And he placed garrisons at key fortified locations, trenches, and felled trees. And he anchors his points between two hills. On his left is Evas, and on his right is Olympus. And between the hills is a river that bisects them. Cleomenes places his perioikoi and allies. The perioikoi are the free citizens of Sparta, but not elite homoioi, which are the actual elite core soldiers, on Mount Evis, led by his brother Euclides to hold that flank. And then Cleomenes places himself on Mount Olympus with the Spartans and the mercenaries. And on the flat land, he places some mercenaries and cavalry formations, led by Onius on the river Onius. When Antigonus arrives, Antigonus realizes that the position of Cleomenes is well chosen and doesn't immediately attack it. He can afford to wait, and Cleomenes can't. So Antigonus withdraws to the stream Gorgolus and camps there. And he's trying to bait the Spartans out. He's trying to find a flank to turn or some weakness. And again, the Spartans really aren't interested in giving battle yet. But even realizing that he does have to eventually give battle, Antigonus places his Macedonian foot and Illyrians opposite Elis under the command of Alexander. And Demetrius controls the Illyrians. The Acarnanians, Cretans, and 2,000 Achaean foot were placed in reserve behind them. The horse were placed in the middle. See, this is unusual. Most ancient battles do not place cavalry in the middle. But because it was two hills sort of flanking a river that was otherwise flat land, it was more suitable to deploy the horses in the center. And then we have, let's see here, he then places his horse on the banks of the Onius River opposite the enemies, which were led by Alexander, in turn flanked by 1,000 Achaean foot and Megalopolitan mercenaries. Antigonus himself is opposite Cleomenes on Mount Olympus. And so Antigonus also deploys his Macedonian phalanx in a double deep formation, in part because the space of the battle is limited. I also wonder if Antigonus was trying to replicate the strategy of Leuctra, where the heavier wing of Epaminondas smashed the Spartans. And so in front of his phalanx are the Illyrian mercenaries, which he then gives a command. He says that, he's going to have flags raised. So the battle was to commence with an attack on both hills, when a linen flag was raised, signaling the Illyrians to attack Evas, and a red flag signaling an attack on Olympus by the Megalopolitans and the horse of the king's forces. The initial attack on Mount Evis was led by the Illyrians, and basically it was largely successful initially. Philopoemen was a junior cavalry officer held in reserve, and the Illyrians were pushing Euclides' forces up the mountain. But there was a tactical error on the part of the Illyrians. There was a small band of troops that Euclides had held in reserve for a flanking operation, and they had attacked the exposed flanks and rear of the Illyrians, causing them much discomfort. Philopoemen wanted to attack, and his immediate superior said no. He later ignored his superior and attacked Euclides' flanking force, dispersing it, giving the Illyrians time to then push Euclides off the hill. Now, here we get a somewhat conflicting report from Plutarch. In the life of Philopoemen, when we get to this part of the battle, that's as I've said. But in the life of Cleomenes, he indicates that there was some sort of treachery whereby support or allies did not come to Euclides' aid, but it's not really explained. And it's just kind of a throwaway line, so I don't know what to make of that. But eventually, due to the bold decisions of Philopoemen, the Spartan left is completely destroyed. Seeing that the left is destroyed, Cleomenes is like, well, okay, I better attack now and try to salvage it on the right, because otherwise they're just going to roll up the whole flank. And so the Spartan forces leave their prepared defensive positions, though he does then engage the Macedonian forces, which double deep after a dispirited fight crush the Spartans, and their right flank is destroyed as well. And then Cleomenes, with his horse guard, the Hippias, flee to Gythium to then flee to Alexandria. Antigonus besieges Sparta, takes the city, basically treats them fairly and allows them to have their own laws, and decides to return to Macedonia now that the war is over. And he's also hearing news that the Illyrians are once again invading. Now, he does defeat the Illyrian invasion and then dies of a ruptured blood vessel through the exertions during the battle. Something that's commented on by both Polybius and Plutarch is how ironic the winds of chance and fate are. Whereas if Cleomenes had but waited just a little bit longer, Antigonus would have been recalled anyhow in order to save his kingdom, and he could have defeated whatever remained of the Achaean League. But again, it was the decisive element of losing support from Ptolemaic Egypt that brought down Sparta's long game, forcing him to act in a way that was rash and not consistent with his broader strategy.
Right. Well, the Battle of Sellasia, the formations are very unorthodox. What you had mentioned earlier is that you've got the cavalry of both the Macedonians, or the League, and then Sparta. You've got both of the cavalry formations in the center, and then there's basically 4 hills, or really 3 hills, where Antigonus, Dawson, and Alexander have their forces on, one opposing hill. And with Antigonus, Dawson's forces, he's got the white shields as well as the Celt and other various mercenaries. And then Alexander has the Achaean infantry, the bronze shields, and then the infantry from Epirus, the Boeotians, and the this is a really difficult one to pronounce, but it's the
Achaeans.
Thank you. Yeah. So they have basically a robust coalition fighting up against the Spartans. And you're right. What you had summarized is that the Spartan left flank had basically collapsed and it could not sustain itself, and so that drove Cleomenes down into more open territory. And regardless of the strength and the reputation of the Spartan phalanx, they were not able to hold against the numbers of the League's larger numbers and the greater coalition in general. Now, that is basically the battle of the Cleomenean War. Following that, Cleomenes, he had basically urged the Spartan population to accept Antigonus's terms. Now, this, from what I've read in preparation for this episode, when Antigonus entered the city of Sparta, this was the first time that Sparta had ever basically hosted some kind of like foreign conqueror, and there was nothing. Up to that point, in Sparta's military defeats, it always had sort of accepted terms, or the Spartans usually had at least hegemony or some type of control over their own city. But this was the first time when a conqueror entered the city gates, and the Spartans knew who their new leader was. So that was a huge historical moment for Sparta, because they had always enjoyed their, either their defensive doctrines, as was the case with, some of the forces that were there at Argos against Pyrrhus, also the Spartans had dealt with a lot of. They were also a great defensive army, not just with their phalanx and their Spartan warriors who grew up as warriors. So that was the first time that the Spartans ever had to deal with a foreign ruler. So that I thought that was really interesting.
Now, what's interesting, if we take the big picture view of the Cleomenean War, we see that both the Achaeans and the Spartans had not really raised the art of siegecraft to a very high level. So we saw with the siege of Argos, they had the Spartans had to find some obscure way in, i.e., this underground tunnel, or find bribery or deception, as we saw with the fall of Argos. The second time, first to Cleomenes, then to Aratus, and then Cleomenes' attempt to regain it, but it defected to the Achaeans, and so. Also, you had to find a weakness in the wall of Megalopolis. And these are not lasting gains, which is why I think these cities just kind of flipped depending on whose army was there last. We see that the Macedonian art of war had been maintained for the last century. Antigonus is able to besiege city after city, or at least threaten to do so, and get them to heal, able to engage the Spartans in battle and defeat them. He's also able to coordinate naval operations with the flanking maneuver, which allowed him to support the attack on Argos itself. So clearly Antigonus is a competent commander, taking the art of war to its highest level. What we see that's interesting as well is that the Achaeans are still largely fighting in this loose order formation, though there are some that are elite cavalry formations, as again the forces led by Philopoemen of Megalopolis. And that's really the main combat element of the Achaeans in this war, is their cavalry element, which is the decisive element in the Battle of Sellasia itself. So now we look at Sparta, and again, we see that Cleomenes has been studying what's been going on in the broader wars in the Mediterranean. His style of fighting with prepared positions and defenses and entrenchments is very un-Spartan, and in fact is very much more like the Romans and Carthaginians. Now, we do know back in the first Punic War with Xenothippus, who was Spartan general who organized the defeat of the Roman general Regulus, that there was some contact between Sparta and the West. So Sparta was at a higher level of military development than even Carthage was, being able to give Carthage advice. So it seems that the old ways of the hoplite shoulder to shoulder warfare, where the walls of Sparta were its men, they began to realize that things had changed so much that they had learned some from their defeat at Leuctra and Mantinea, and realized that they had to do things differently. But it was almost too little too late, though, given that they were going up against the Macedonians, who had already perfected this new art of war, which, when we get back to the Romans, we'll realize is already obsolete anyhow, and when we get to the Battle of Cynocephalae and Pydna. But again, the Romans aren't involved yet, and the Macedonians are still at the highest level. We'll see also that the Macedonians and the Spartans were able to make very rapid marches. Within a year's time, they could march the length and breadth of the Peloponnesus, which shows as well that they had sort of mastered, the art of quick marching. And the Achaeans are doing rather poorly. They do learn, and under the strategiship of Philopoemen, which will be the topic of our next episode, they become an elite fighting force. But at the moment, they have a lot to learn. But they learn quickly, and they learn from, a competent senior ally, Antigonus of Macedon. Also, Antigonus of Macedon doesn't take the bait when, in the winter months, with the leading to the attack on Megalopolis, Cleomenes tries to bait him out. He waits. Unlike, for example, Aristomachus, who didn't wait and had his entire force destroyed. So I would have to rank the Macedonians as the best, the Spartans as the second, and the Achaeans as a distant third. But that will change in coming years.
Right. Well, the Macedonian intervention was one of the large turning points as well, because that was also the simultaneous. That is when the Ptolemaic Egypt had again started supporting, I believe, the League in general, because again, you see sort of these flip-flopping allegiances between different powers, and so that was definitely the case. One interesting thing that happened too is that after the defeat at Sellasia is that Cleomenes he fled to Egypt because by that point again there was again a stop in funding of support for the Achaean League because the Ptolemies had recognized that they were becoming a bit too powerful, and they no longer thought that they needed help from Ptolemaic Egypt anymore. And so Cleomenes was accepted in Egypt as sort of this friend of Ptolemy IV. But then there's some speculation here that Cleomenes was trying to create some sort of uprising against Ptolemy IV. And so he was put under house arrest, but then he escaped the house arrest and he tried to create an uprising in Egypt. But after that had failed, Cleomenes and sort of his inner circle of officers and friends, they had actually committed suicide. So that was sort of the end of Cleomenes, kind of an interesting final chapter for him. But yeah, really, when taking a big sort of retrospective look back at everything, the Macedonian intervention is what really turned things around for the Achaean League. And it was really the reforms in 208 from Philopoemen into a more heavy infantry style hoplite formation that really turned them around. And what had made Sparta so successful, at least in the initial stages of the war, was that Cleomenes, as you said earlier, was either taking notes from the Romans and he could see the new developments of war in the Mediterranean, or and I highly doubt that this is very likely that these tactics were discovered and implemented on his own. But I'm sure that this was an influence from the Romans.
The other thing that we see is even though the Achaean League does relatively poorly in combat until the very, very end, at the decisive battle of Sellasia, with the horse of Philopoemen, the key advantage they have is diplomatic. Sparta has long been the hegemon of the Peloponnesus, or had been until the Theban War with Epaminondas, and had a reputation that most people in the Peloponnesus did not want a return to Spartan rule. And so the Achaean League, learning from the mistakes of Athens and not exalting one city-state at the expense of the others, to act in a high-handed manner which undermines the principles of democratic equality, was able to build an endurance that the Spartans could not deal with. Cleomenes could make promises, but he couldn't deliver on those promises. And we saw with Argos. Argos returned to the fold. And the destruction of Megalopolis just outraged the rest of the Peloponnesians. They're like, this is what we could expect from the Spartans. And of course, Megalopolis had suffered under the yoke as Helots for a very, very long time under Sparta, which explains why they didn't want to be under Spartan rule again. I mean, in fact, why would you trust the Spartans? What's interesting is Plutarch takes a very pro-Spartan approach in much of his histories, and Polybius, he's not anti-Spartan, but he's not as favorable. I think his favor tends towards the Achaeans. What's interesting, though, is that you shouldn't trust Sparta. There was an incident during the Peloponnesian War where they offered freedom to their helots, and they said, "Well, look, if you fight for us, we'll give you your freedom." And then they were all summarily executed. And then the Spartans said, "Well, those were troublemakers." Well, okay, and if that's what the word of a Spartan is worth, no wonder nobody believed Cleomenes, because Plutarch is like, well, Cleomenes gave a great deal. Why didn't they accept it? Well, because you can't trust the word of a Spartan. That's why. And so it's this sort of political. See, this is what's interesting. In the Federalist number 18, the United States Federalist Papers talks about the Achaean League as a model for the U.S. Republic. It is interesting to speculate that had that league formed earlier with leadership as spirited as Aratus and Philopoemen, they might have been a competitor to Rome, because like the Roman Republic, which we've already discussed earlier, they seem to be able to integrate new cities on a more or less equal footing into the league and keep it organized and effective as a fighting force. But by the time they are able to sort of perfect this method of expansion, the Romans had already beaten Carthage. And it was just too little too late for the Greeks to muster an effective resistance to Rome. But it does seem that the Achaeans were, if not directly influenced by Rome, indirectly in being able to build this successful commonwealth, which was almost too little too late.
Right. Well, I will say that for the Cleomenean War, that this is kind of a bit more of an obscure war in the sense that it's just something that's just not really discussed among the public consciousness. I mean, everyone talks about World War II. Lesser people will talk about the Punic War, but these sort of developments in the Peloponnesus between these competing leagues, this is certainly one of the more obscure wars that I've actually had to study. And so, what you see, and this is something that I think you summarized fairly well, is that you start to see the integration of Roman tactics into the Greek system of fighting, because some of these leagues are dependent on foreign money, and they're much smaller in size compared to Rome, and so they had to sort of undergo these new sort of reforms in order to maintain their own hegemonies, whether that was Sparta, or whether that was the Macedonians or the Aetolians, who were just north of the Isthmus of Corinth, or the Achaeans. No matter who is being discussed here, that these new tactics and new politics basically had to be implemented. And so this is where you see it's more of a confederation to have greater territory among, rather than just one city-state vying for power against another in a sea of city-states. You see this consolidation of power. The other interesting thing as far as this war goes is in the Battle of Sellasia, the formations were just so bizarre to me to study that, because you're right. Normally in the formation of battles of antiquity, cavalry is typically out on both of the flanks, and then the center is typically made up of infantry, and behind that is either slingers in the case of ancient Greece, or archers. And so this was just an entirely different battle. There was sort of, three hills where the infantry had dug in, and this is where the Roman element comes into play. Or, at least, again, if it's not Roman, it's certainly very new on the part of the Greeks. So, and again, Polybius and Plutarch, it's, at least from what I had read, there was nothing clear that indicates, or there was no clear indication that the Greeks just that they were in contact with the Romans, and that there was like this direct sort of transfer of new tactics. I think it was just, if your commander, such as Cleomenes, if he was being diligent enough to implement his new tactics, then the commanders are the ones who were basically paying attention to these new developments on the battlefield. But so you see sort of a new style of politics for the Greeks, which is the formation of confederations and coalitions, which, again, coalitions had been formed in the past, but they didn't have any sort of lasting effect. And then you also have the implementation of new tactics. So, and again, that's more of fortification building in the middle of a campaign. So, fairly interesting overall, though.
All right. Well, thank you again, Terminal Philosophy. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
This is Todd Lewis of the Prison Folly Podcast.